introduction. I'm just going to have a quick talk to you this evening, and thank you so much for staying so long. Everyone must be getting a bit hangry by now. About what we can do to protect ourselves and control infections out in the field. And I guess it's probably a fairly pertinent time to be doing this. So Joe Taylor, who was going to join me in presenting this information from Hunter New England Health, is currently, I think, drowning in a sea of COVID with the local Hunter surge, so she's not able to be here as well. But I'd also just like to recognise the other contributors on this work, and we've been working together with a number of people: Diana Mendez, Jane Heller, Joan Carrick, the previous presenter, in and just improving people's biosecurity practices. So I'd particularly like to acknowledge Diana Mendez from James Cook University for providing the material about zoonoses that I'm presenting tonight. So from the work that was conducted with the breeding industry in about 2018, after the chlamydia psittaci emergence through 2016 and 17 as a recognised cause of abortion, and therefore a potential zoonotic risk, we identified from industry 5 potential themes that were barriers and enablers to personal biosecurity and infection control. Understanding zoonoses and zoonotic risk was one of those important themes. And this will be the major focus of this discussion tonight. And I basically want to, as I said earlier, thank Diana Mendez. This particular presentation is a condensed version of a webinar which will be available to you initially on HTBA's website and then likely onto the state TBA websites as well, as a resource to help everyone in industry understand zoonoses and zoonotic risk better. So the third aspect of what we'll be alerting you to tonight is just some other useful resources available to help you in keeping yourselves safe in relation to infectious disease. So apart from an increased risk awareness of zoonotic risk, there were a few other themes that emerged as barriers and enablers to personal biosecurity in the 2018 work. One of those was the fact that the personal protective equipment available to us is not really fit for purpose, and particularly with foalings and obstetric work, that has been recognised as a major issue, and there's been a working group formed to try and address this problem and actually access and develop potentially better PPE, which is going to be easier and better to use. Other areas that came out were strong leadership and encouraging environments were identified as being necessary to achieve sustainable changes in habits, and the requirement for some industry standards in the central hub of resources for use by industry was also identified. So just moving on to understanding zoonotic risks in order to stay safe. Before we can understand what zoonotic risks are, we need to understand what zoonoses are and why they exist. Zoonoses then are particular types of infectious diseases that can affect animals and humans, and they can be caused by bacteria, viruses, parasites, and even prions, which is the organism responsible for mad cow disease. Zoonoses can be transmitted from animals to animals of the same species, or they can be transmitted from animals to animals of different species. Most importantly, zoonoses can be transmitted from animals to humans and from humans to animals, including between horses and humans. Some zoonoses are well known, and some are unknown, and some are yet to emerge. And I think the important thing about this particular slide is that around 75% of all emerging diseases, infectious diseases in humans, are of animal origin. Some known zoonoses haven't been seen for a period of time and re-emerge under certain circumstances, or can re-emerge in new susceptible species. So then what are zoonoses? Zoonoses are infectious diseases that can be transmitted between animals and humans. How are zoonoses transmitted to humans? They're transmitted to humans through various pathways, and they can be airborne, they can be transmitted via vectors such as mozzies and ticks, it can be a foodborne transmission, or they can be passed on to humans who spend directly have direct contact with animals or are in close proximity to animals. So therefore, zoonoses are transmitted to humans by direct or indirect contact with animals or their products. Can zoonoses be transmitted human to human? Well, the answer is yes, which means that zoonoses are as much a biosecurity risk between animals and humans as they are a public health problem. So the very timely example of this is what we're all living through at the moment, COVID. COVID has been reported to come out of bats or wildlife into pangolins and then into humans from eating pangolin meat. So basically, the most plausible explanation of COVID is just that it's a spillover from animals into humans. So it's important to realise that if you get exposed to a zoonotic disease and become infected, you could be a source of infection to others at work and the community at large, including your family and friends. So by protecting yourself from zoonotic risks, you're also protecting others in the community. Why should you be concerned about equine zoonoses? And aside from the obvious reason that you're working with horses, it's important to understand how equine zoonoses may emerge. And for that, we have to look at how humans interact with horses, which is quite different to how humans interact with other types of animals. With horses, the human-horse relationship is very much at the crossroad between the relationship humans have with pets and livestock. Horses don't live in our homes, but humans tend to have a very close relationship with their horses as they would with their pets. Horses live or spend long periods of time in the field where they can come in contact with zoonoses-carrying wildlife. And therefore, the overlap is ideal for new zoonoses to emerge. So hence, humans interacting with horses at a higher rate are at higher risk of being exposed to a new emerging zoonosis and need to take care around potential zoonotic risks. Good example of this zoonotic risk through contact with horses is the emergence of Hendra in 1994. Hendra's probably been around in bats for a period of time, but then it spilled over into horses and from horses to humans, in some cases with really dire results. So to date, 4 people have died of Hendra virus. All of them have been closely caring for horses without taking adequate precautions against zoonotic risk. So there are many references in the literature to zoonotic risks linked to horses. And in Australia, there's a number of known zoonoses that can be transmitted from horses to humans. And while some are more common than others have the potential to become an issue for people working with horses. And of course, we have to consider the risks from zoonoses that have not yet emerged. And you'll see on this list that at the top of it is Hendra virus, and as Neve has discussed, salmonella, methicillin-resistant staph or MRSA, golden staph, and then a whole list of other organisms. And psittacosis is actually at the bottom of that with Q fever because we haven't really got quite enough information to draw a distinct line. The testing in humans is not very good between psittacosis of horse origin, although there have been some very prominent sort of cases which have occurred, and certainly the risk profile seems very high. We certainly need to do some more work in this area. So equine zoonoses can be transmitted via direct contact with horses or via contact with urine, feces, manure, and other bodily or airborne fluids. So in your lines of work, it's unlikely that you can avoid coming into contact with not only the horses themselves, but all their other potentially contaminated materials. So you should inform yourselves about zoonoses because the majority of infectious diseases have an animal origin, including from horses. Why should you prevent zoonoses? Zoonoses present a biosecurity risk as they can be transmitted from horses back to animals in your care. And because zoonoses can be transmitted human to human, there's also a workplace health and safety issue for you, your colleagues, and your clients. And finally, we often forget about this part. People working with animals can be sources of zoonoses for other people in the community and become the source of a public health problem. So you should endeavour to prevent the transmission of zoonoses in your workplace to protect yourself, your colleagues and clients, but also your horse patients. How can you protect yourself from others from zoonoses? Well, with the interviews that got done in 2018 with industry participants after the chlamydia psittaci emergence as a recognised as a cause of abortion, you all understood and clearly articulated that the idea that prevention yields the biggest success in protection. So just as looking at a few resources, the ABA has made personal biosecurity guidelines available online, and these can help develop your own strategies. And even though they are targeted at veterinary practices, there's a lot of relevant information in those resources for farms as well. So if you're unsure about what level of personal protective equipment to use, there's a few rules of thumb that have been developed in association with EVA, the Equine Vets Australia, and they are adopting a tiered approach to the level of PPE that you're using, commensurate with the risk that you are exposed to. So if you're conducting a non-invasive procedure on a healthy horse, you should consider wearing gloves, some eye protection, and some form of clothing protection. If the horse is healthy but the procedure is invasive and you're likely to come in contact with body fluids, you should also consider wearing a disposable P2 mask. And much as that was, something that people found incredibly difficult to even contemplate, now that we're in the middle of COVID, the whole idea of wearing masks is a lot more palatable, even if still uncomfortable. I think the most important thing here is that a P2 respirator, which are the ones with the little valves on the front, have much better efficacy than just the surgical masks we are using. However, any would be better than none. So if you're dealing with a sick horse, then you should consider using maximum PPE protection. And that also applies if you're dealing with a sick horse displaying Hendra signs and it's not vaccinated against Hendra. So we held a forum in June in Scone with industry participants, and you further crystallised the thoughts and strategies to improve personal biosecurity in the breeding industry. And the main strategies that came out of that forum, which were deemed necessary, or the sorts of things that would be useful to help personal biosecurity, were an increased risk of awareness about zoonotic risks, and hopefully this presentation will help that. And the one that will be up on the HTBA website is a longer version of this, and it goes into a bit more explanation around zoonoses in general. And we hope that that helps you with that goal. The other things that were decided upon was to develop or amend policies and procedures whilst keeping any of these amended practices affordable, providing strong leadership to drive a supportive work culture and creating supportive environments to facilitate personal biosecurity, encourage change in PPE usage behaviours, and also having a centralised hub of resources available for use by industry participants, which we are endeavouring to get together for you on the HTBA website initially. So you can protect yourself and others from zoonotic risk by following personal biosecurity guidelines, and it is important that you do, given the fact that many of the emerging diseases in humans come from animals. So just to sum up about zoonoses, they are infectious diseases that can be transmitted to humans from wildlife or domestic animals, including from horses. It's a two-way street, just important to remember that we can also transfer diseases back to our horse patients. So zoonoses present an uncertain risk to humans, as some are yet to emerge, and you should always assume the risk is present at all times. Zoonoses can be transmitted humans to human and become a public health issue when that happens. They can make you mildly sick or severely sick, and in rare situations, they can actually kill you, as is the situation with Hendra, and not all medical treatments are always available. But you can protect yourself and others from zoonotic risks by following personal biosecurity recommendations. And it's important just to remember that your health matters, and that it's important not to get caught out, and prevention being the best form of success, when you prevent these problems happening, everything's sweet, so nothing seems to have happened. But it's avoiding the disastrous situations that we're trying to help you do. So just to finish, I'd like to just alert you to some of the TBA resources that are already available to you to help navigate the COVID situation at the moment. And, you know, COVID is exactly an example of what we're trying to help get you to protect yourselves against with zoonotic risk. It's important to understand your business obligations in relation to COVID, and these resources are up on the New South Wales and Victorian TBA websites, as well as the HTBA website. It's also important to keep up to date with the latest health advice from the government sites, and there are some government resources on this slide as well. So during the next 1 to 2 weeks, there'll be various resources uploaded initially to the HTBA website and then to the state TBA websites, hopefully from percolating out from there, to provide you with a central hub to access relevant information around protecting yourself on farm, in the field. A pilot program this year has just about to kick off, which is basically having industry participants who have voluntarily decided to be part of this pilot in the Hunter, looking at personal biosecurity and infection control procedures on farms and in practices to improve everybody's day-to-day practices around biosecurity. And the results of that program will be shared with industry in due course. At this point in time, there will be various farms have decided on certain strategies that they may well like to implement in a way to improve their personal biosecurity practices across the board. So the HTBA website will be our initial hub for resources, and that'll include the fully narrated version of this webinar about zoonoses. It's a click through, you can do it at your own pace. I think it goes for about 17 minutes, and it's slightly expanded on what we've presented tonight, but it's a really useful resource for helping people understand zoonoses. There'll be a number of one-pages for display around farms and clinics, including zoonoses information, information around hand hygiene, tiered approaches to personal protective equipment usage, and also some links to videos of putting on and putting off PPE and the tiered approach to personal biosecurity. Can zoonoses transfer from humans to animals? Yes, they can. So it's a two-way street, definitely. And there's this wonderful zoonosis resource that we've been provided with by Diana explains that really well. In 10 minutes or 15 minutes, I couldn't give the whole presentation, but it will be there for you to use as a resource, and that explains a little bit more about how zoonoses emerge, re-emerge, and the fact that they do go between humans and animals. The next question is, how can you control the population for birds, mainly the breeds that carry chlamydia? Yeah, great question. So chlamydia is a disease that's carried by birds, particularly parrots, and the work that we've done in looking at abortions in mares has shown that the isolates that we get out of those aborted materials are actually the same strain as is circulating in parrots, native parrots, sotocockies, and all the colourful birds. And certainly that's a tricky thing. How do you actually maintain some degree of distance between those animals and your horses? And it's really interesting to watch certain bird species coming across over feed runs and things, and just swooping down. They get very habituated as to knowing what is going on different farms, and my understanding is anecdotally that certain feeds are more attractive to them than others, and so that's something that perhaps could be investigated. And yeah, it's a real challenge, and it's a challenge of us our animals coming into contact with wildlife at that interface. The next question, so I'm not sure I've actually answered that terribly adequately. Hopefully we're going to keep a few birds around and they're not all going to be dispatched, because it's a tricky situation to try and manage them, but they are manageable. And I think cleaning feeders and all of those sorts of things are important. We have done a lot of sampling on farms over the years with the 2016-17 cluster that we had. We did a lot of sampling because we were asked to start screening for chlamydia psittaci by DPI, and we found it, perhaps as a cause that we weren't necessarily expecting and hadn't recognised before. So basically, yeah, it's an interesting situation trying to manipulate the natural environment such that we can allow our animals to be safely in that environment. The next question is, can you give some examples of zoonoses transmitting from humans to horses? So interestingly, Michelle, we certainly have MRSA can transfer between horses and humans. That's probably the major one. I suppose you potentially could have ringworm going the other way as well. So those would be the main ones. But I think, looking at the COVID situation, you can see that once there's a possibility of any species being a potential host for any zoonotic organism, and it's dependent on exposure, levels of exposure, and the ability of that particular organism to take up residence in the particular species in question. I think there might be one more in the Q&A. Joan Catherine from John Sunderland, have you had many or increase in C. psittaci cases this year, and does the environment and weather conditions have any bearing on pregnancy loss? I'm going to hand that one straight over to Joan, if she's still here, because she is the one who's on the front line of looking at most of the pregnancy losses, and I am not.
I can just add, can you, I hope you can hear me, but I can add in that there haven't been many cases. We have had one or two this year, which has surprised me. I thought, based on what we saw in 2016, with this year having been quite wet, that we would see an increase again, and we haven't. Nothing like 2016. It seems to be pretty similar to the previous couple of years, where we're just getting a couple, the sporadic ones. So, I mean, we don't see every abortion that occurs, and so there may be others that are occurring that I'm not aware of. I haven't spoken to the team at the DPI lately, because they've got a much better idea. But yeah, certainly we haven't. But I think it's a good question, John, and I think that it sort of it emphasises the point that we need to do some more understanding of the whole ecology of the birds and how they're interacting with horses. And I think that's, similar to how we did with the caterpillars, to understand after, the 2012 problems we had, that understand the life cycle and how they fit in and what's going on, so that we know when we can intervene. So, I think that's the crucial thing, is we now know what to do with caterpillars, and we need to get a similar understanding for chlamydia psittaci in birds, I think.
Yeah, I'd agree totally. And I think the interesting thing is that, every few years something else emerges, and it's not going to be the last thing. So we are constantly kind of chasing down new pathogens and reducing, particularly from an abortion perspective, that number of unknown cases of loss. And I think that will happen over time as we have better molecular diagnostic techniques and are able to diagnose more and more. Our ability to actually define losses will be much greater. But yes, there has been some work done. Susie Anstey did a PhD looking at the amount of C. psittaci circulating serologically in mares, how many antibodies were detected. And there was, Joan, you might be able to clarify this, some indication out of that work that certainly the colder months and the sort of June, July weather events where it was colder and wetter, there was certainly an increase in an indication of exposure to C. psittaci.
Yeah, I think that seemed to go along, but once again, the prevalence was pretty low relatively
Yeah, and I think that's what's really interesting about this. This disease was a real problem in 16, 17, and really since then it hasn't had a major cluster like it did at that stage that I'm aware of. There have been sporadic cases and certainly not the same sorts of numbers that we were getting.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is to, looking at the work that's been published out of Melbourne, Joe Devlin, Romana's work, that looking at that committee of Sitakai coming, and their 25-year look, it's certainly been around for quite a while, and it certainly affects most of Southeast Australia. I mean, certainly not just what's going on here. And I mean, the public health people say that it's more common in Victoria, because they tend to have colder, wetter winters. Well, maybe with climate change we'll be having less cold, wet winters, so there'll be that change. But I think we need to just understand the ecology of birds and horses better.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a really important point about the climate and the changing climate. We're going to see things in places that we aren't used to seeing them because of those very the pressures that are put on the ecological systems that our animals are existing in or very close to. So we're seeing things emerging in places that we haven't seen them before. So that's an important thing, and that's another good reason why it's really important to have good biosecurity practices and personal protective practices around, hand washing, all of the simple stuff. It's not very sexy, but it's important, and it makes a big, big difference to, the likelihood of you getting ill or and not transferring and being a fomite and transferring anything between animals.
And I think. I think that slide where we look at the importance of horses and the relationship they have, the close relationship they have with people, and the fact that they're in the environment. So that they are a species that are much higher risk, and therefore everybody who's working with horses just has to, I mean, we don't want to go silly, but we just need to keep that in the back of our mind, that that if a disease emerges, we've got a good chance it'll come in Australia, but it's a good chance it'll transfer from horses to people.
Yes, we have very close relationships. That's right. And the webinar that Diana has put together has more information around those transmissions and emergence and re-emergence and what happens species to species.